Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A warm welcome, dear viewers, to this edition of Mena-Watch Talks. My name is Florian Markel, and it is once again a great honor today to extend a warm welcome to Thomas von der Osten-Sacken, with whom we will again be discussing the situation in Iran and in the broader region. Today, Thomas is joining us from France. So, with that, hello, Thomas. It's great that you've made time for us again.
Yes, good morning.
So let's talk again, now that it's been a few weeks since our last conversation. Let's discuss the situation in Iran, or rather, several of the theaters there. Perhaps let's start in Iran itself, or with Iran itself. This week there are numerous reports about Trump, who has suddenly discovered, or rather, now intends to implement, a brand new, quote-unquote, strategy. Lately, he's been focusing on, yes, the economic strangulation of the Iranian regime, meaning economic sanctions the likes of which the world has never seen, the biggest, the worst, the toughest. All just superlatives, of course. Is this a strategy, and to what end? We still don't know, do we?
Well, sanctions are a tactic, one might say, because a strategy also needs a more long-term objective. When it's suddenly brought into discussion as an alternative to a war that has already been fought, especially after it has become quite evident that one has not achieved their military objectives, then these sanctions clearly represent a concession of weakness. It demonstrates that, militarily speaking, at least none of the goals that were declared in March and February have been achieved in any way whatsoever, revealing a significant strategic shortfall. Iran has already been subjected to a pretty severe sanctions regime for decades. Therefore, the question of whether one can truly tighten the screws even more, to such an extent, is debatable. Ought to be approached with a multitude of serious questions, especially since Iran's principal trading partner happens to be China. And China has already explicitly stated that it will not be swayed or impressed by these recent announcements. And there is also a new summit meeting between Trump and Xi scheduled to take place fairly soon, actually. And if China fails to comply with that, and India also doesn't comply, then these trade sanctions will at least not be quite as severe as initially announced. What's interesting in this context is that Iran has also continued to carry out low-threshold attacks on neighboring countries. One of these nations is the United Arab Emirates, which has consistently been a vital hub for Iranian foreign trade, encompassing both legal and illegal activities. Last week, the United Arab Emirates announced that they were discontinuing all their activities benefiting Iran. This means these sanctions would certainly impact Iran quite severely. There's no question about that. But whether they'll genuinely achieve the stated objective, as declared on Truth Social, that should indeed be met with considerable skepticism. And one must always remember that such sanctions invariably, without exception, primarily impact the general populace first and foremost. The situation of the people in Iran, whom they supposedly intended to liberate, according to the announcements made at the end of February, has dramatically deteriorated even further over the past few months. The currency continues to depreciate, food prices have escalated even more, and the electricity supply has become significantly worse. This means what one must, at the very least, keep in mind with such things is that the ones who primarily suffer are always the people of Iran and not the regime itself. We know this from other sanctions regimes, like in Iraq in the 90s or elsewhere.
It also doesn't really give the impression of being coordinated in any way. Given that Trump also doesn't really tend to coordinate his policies with any other countries, this measure, taken by the United Arab Emirates, doesn't seem to have been discussed or coordinated with Trump in any way. Rather, it was apparently a more or less immediate reaction to Iranian shelling.
Well, and what's also important is that for such sanctions to be effective, they actually need to be. I mean, these are unilaterally announced ad hoc sanctions by the president. Normally there are sanctions that are imposed by Congress. And it should also never be forgotten that, according to the American Constitution, this war would actually require congressional approval. Steps should be coordinated with both Congress and the Senate in the United States. All of this is just simply decided by the executive based on daily whims and without any discussion with other partners. You know, in the past, a sanctions regime was something that was coordinated with EU partners, NATO partners, and other countries, and then implemented accordingly. Whereas Trump is now using these sanctions as secondary sanctions. So any country trading with Iran will be sanctioned by the US. Exactly how that's supposed to function is somewhat unclear to me, and simultaneously, Trump is once again escalating conflicts with former US allies, for example with Canada, at this very moment imposing new tariffs. This means that nobody outside the US and outside this administration, I think, will have any particularly great interest in jumping on board with this now.
Right, we've seen this before. When Trump wants to divert from something embarrassing, he pulls Greenland out, or Canada in this case. These are simply the typical diversionary tactics that we should already be quite familiar with by now. But back to the question. It's still not clear to me, what are these sanctions actually aiming for? I mean, what's supposed to be achieved? Is the goal to bring Iran back to the negotiating table to sign an agreement that nobody will stick to anyway? Or what is the goal? What would the Iranians have to do? So what exactly would need to transpire for these sanctions to be judged a success and then concluded?
You're asking a big question. I honestly don't know either. Well, nothing has really been explicitly formulated, but I do think ultimately, given that the objective of overthrowing the regime was taken off the table many months ago, it can only truly involve a negotiated solution. This resolution would then again proceed along the lines of that strange memorandum of understanding that was signed a few months ago and was actually a complete victory for Iran across the board, truly. The only explanations we still get are, we don't want Iran to have a nuclear program. But strategically, I haven't heard much more than that over the last few days and weeks, to be honest. Well, by now, what's essentially become a direct consequence of the war, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, has practically turned into a primary war objective, namely the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which had remained open right up until the end of February. So, as J.D. Vance recently stated quite clearly, our primary objective is to ensure the Strait of Hormuz remains open. This is despite the fact that the Strait of Hormuz was indeed open as of February. Therefore, what we're seeing is that. We're basically seeing what we've been seeing this entire time. There's no grand strategy here. These are merely ad hoc tactical decisions being made in a situation where, slowly, worldwide and in the US, more and more people, analysts, and politicians are reaching the grim conclusion that the US has lost this war. And they're also the administration is currently facing immense pressure because elections are set to take place this November. Given the soaring gas prices and various other factors, the Republicans find themselves in a rather unfavorable starting position for these upcoming elections, which could significantly impact their performance.
And if economic sanctions can achieve anything, it's always with a considerable delay. This means that if the midterm elections were genuinely an ultimatum or a firm deadline, then it's already quite apparent that absolutely nothing will have changed in terms of tangible effects by then.
Yeah, plus, of course, apologies for interrupting. So, Iran and Russia are countries that have existed under sanctions regimes for a very long time. And they've naturally found an incredible number of ways and means to circumvent them. Iran is an expert at the circumvention of economic sanctions, through smuggling, for example, or through misrepresenting the declaration of goods. Iran shares incredibly long land borders with Pakistan, Turkey, and Iraq. All sorts of contraband are smuggled across these borders, sometimes with the approval of its neighboring governments, and sometimes without. So the question of whether such sanctions will genuinely bring Iran to its knees should be approached with extreme skepticism, perhaps even a very, very big question mark. It's more accurate to view this as an attempt to save face, considering their military approach has utterly failed, because now, to declare that we are completely withdrawing from this conflict wouldn't be would. It would be a geopolitical catastrophe, and of course, wouldn't really fit with Trump's psychological constitution, let's say.
Right. Well, as for Trump's motivations, it's pointless to speculate. He keeps making announcements that I don't think are even taken seriously by his closest allies in the US anymore. Well then, last week there was this declaration that the Strait of Hormuz is now American territory. Nobody in the entire world takes that announcement seriously. But anyway, part of the erratic US policy is that without any prior announcements in Iraq, specifically in northern Iraq, they practically withdrew the air defense umbrella over the Kurdish regional government from one day to the next. Let's discuss Iraq a bit. What implications does this withdrawal of American air defense from northern Iraq have?
It's quite a catastrophe because, as I said, Iraqi Kurdistan had no air defense of its own and was dependent on the American one, which wasn't there for Iraqi Kurdistan specifically, but for the troops stationed there as part of the anti-ISS coalition. You see, there's this agreement between the Iraqi government and the American government, which actually stipulates that all troops are to be withdrawn by the very end of September. This comes with the stipulation that the militias operating outside the regular army, those predominantly Shiite militias under more or less Iranian command, must then disband, surrender their weaponry, or integrate into the official army. This signifies a considerably important development within Iraq. A crucial development, so to speak, a really significant one within Iraq. Without significantly informing anyone, the Americans, about 2 weeks ago, withdrew their drone and missile defense systems from Iraqi Kurdistan. This action completely exposed Iraqi Kurdistan, making it highly vulnerable to potential attacks from Iran and these militias, a truly precarious situation. And Iran, along with the other groups, immediately exploited that situation to their advantage, attacked the presidential palace, or whatever you want to call it, belonging to the prominent Barzani family, who currently hold the positions of prime minister, just to make it absolutely clear that you are now effectively vulnerable, meaning we can attack you at any time and there's nothing you can do about it. So, at the same time, most importantly, central figures from these militias have explicitly declared that they absolutely will not disarm. They stated that they would not meet the end of September deadline and then proceeded to present a whole host of absolutely impossible demands. So this entire process, which the new Prime Minister, al-Sadr, has truly worked extremely hard to achieve, that is, combating corruption in Iraq and eliminating these armed forces that operate outside of state structures by having them dissolved, is now. Also quite questionable. In Iraq, however, this development was seen very positively because all these militias, like in Yemen or a tremendous issue, there are now apprehensions that if circumstances remain unaltered, a full-blown civil conflict could erupt, where the conventional military would clash with these militias should the government genuinely endeavor to implement this disarmament. And simultaneously, the position of the Kurdish regional government within Iraq has naturally been greatly weakened, given its inability to independently defend itself against the relentless onslaught of massive drone or missile attacks, whether launched by various militias or directly by Iran.
But does the official Iraqi government have any significant support regarding this? So why would they risk this conflict now if, for instance, the Americans aren't particularly interested anymore? And, well, the Iranians are against it anyway. So is there any noteworthy support on the international side?
Yes, I think the general sentiment in Iraq is truly that people now wish to have their who desires to reclaim its sovereignty, to establish a state-controlled army and police force, and to finally disband these militias which, though partially compensated, remain ultimately outside of the state's authority and control. However, there have always been significant protests against this in central and southern Iraq, for instance in 2019, which were only put on hold due to COVID. In Kurdistan, there's also, naturally, immense interest in this matter, and overall, the official line of Iraq is that it maintains neutrality in these conflicts. Of course, they keep good relations with Iran. They must. They also maintain good contacts with the U.S., but they don't want to become some kind of vassal to Iran, and above all, they want to get rid of these parastatal structures. And I think that this has relatively broad support across all segments of the Iraqi population. Otherwise, the Iraqi prime minister would not be able to implement this policy as he is doing right now.
Thinking back to the way the Iraqi army acted against ISIS in Mosul, there was always this cliche that, well, if it really came to a fight between these Iraqi pro-Iranian militias and the Iraqi army, part of the army would run away and the other part would defect. Has that changed since then? Is the army a factor to be taken seriously today?
Well, you bring up Mosul. Mosul was indeed a sort of turning point in the Iraqi army's history, because the newly established elite units, which fought incredibly bloody battles against ISIs to liberate Mosul, were, for the first time ever, not confessionally previously dominated. Before, under Saddam, the Iraqi army was very, very heavily Sunni influenced. So this entire officers' corps was generally made up of Sunnis. After the fall of Saddam, a Shiite army was created, so to speak, which then more or less appeared as an extended arm of the Shiite parties. And since the war against ISIS, where the Iraqi army initially collapsed, at some point it just didn't exist anymore. That's why these militias were created in the first place. An army has already been built that is much more representative of the Iraqi population's composition. It's now widely perceived as a truly Iraqi army, where no single population group dominates the others, simply because the entire officer corps happens to come from just one particular sectarian group. And this desire to truly have Iraqi institutions and a unified Iraqi state, and to slowly overcome this pervasive sectarianism in all areas of state and society, is indeed very strong within Iraq. On the other hand, of course, these militias have long since ceased to be mere militias. These are significant economic players. They're involved in smuggling and have invested substantial funds in various sectors like oil and other parts of the economy. Much like Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're enormously influential figures who are now deeply embedded within the state structures. Integrating them into the state is an incredible challenge, one that certainly becomes much, much harder without the vital support of the United States. Because, as I mentioned, the deal is this: the Americans pull out of Iraq, and in return, the militias become integrated. But we all know that this type of militias announcements, or their statements, can always be trusted with extremely little confidence. And with the withdrawal of the Americans, the Iraqi army will also lose something it could always do before, which was to try to maintain a kind of balance between Iran and the U.S. Well, currently, I would say the general sentiment surrounding this agreement was quite positive, even as recently as 3 months ago. This is now changing, and people are afraid it could lead to renewed chaos. Now it's shifting, and people fear it could truly lead to new chaos.
Chaos is a good keyword. Part of the generally chaotic situation in the Middle East is that new alliances and new coalitions are announced practically every day. One of these new announcements has just happened yet again. In Mecca, a joint military defense pact was signed between Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. This alliance contains an article that is basically modeled on the famous Article 5 of NATO, meaning an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. Is this truly a serious alliance, or is it primarily intended to be a political statement directed at, well, at whom exactly? At the USA?
I think it's actually both. So, on the one hand, it's not just us, but ultimately everyone who perceives that the U.S. as a hegemonic power is. faltering very, very badly and is in no way fulfilling the important role it once did. So people begin rather frantically and quite quickly attempting to reorganize themselves and to react to these very swift developments that are currently unfolding. They must respond to these rapid changes. And I believe this alliance, or rather this defense pact, however one might label it, is in essence a direct reaction to the United States' perceived vulnerabilities on one hand. On the other hand, it's an attempt to exert pressure, even on the US, which previously pursued a strategy through the Abraham Accords. That strategy sought to involve Israel and Saudi Arabia, ultimately creating a new security and economic architecture in the Middle East. This initiative aims to address the perceived shortcomings of the US as a reliable partner in the region, prompting these nations to forge new alliances. That seems highly questionable at the moment. Militarily, the United States has unequivocally been unable to genuinely protect its staunch allies such as Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates. And so now these, let's say, alliances are forming, which on the one hand are clearly directed against Iran. By its very nature, it is a Sunni defense alliance. A Sunni defense alliance comprised of very, very populous nations like Pakistan, which boasts a formidable infantry army, and a country such as Saudi Arabia, possessing substantial financial resources, but lacking, so to speak, the necessary manpower. And a NATO army in Turkey, which is one of the largest NATO armies of all, and is very, very heavily armed, especially when it comes to things like drone technology. And this is most certainly also an endeavor to completely reorient itself for the future. Although Saudi Arabia, at this moment, I believe, is most strongly attempting to have it both ways, so to speak. So for Saudi Arabia, on one side, there remains the perspective of the Abraham Accords, involving cooperation with the United States and Israel. However, should that approach falter or not materialize, then, as it were, they would pivot towards this alliance with Pakistan and Turkey, which is quite appealing from a Saudi viewpoint. There are nuclear bombs in Pakistan and a highly developed drone program in Turkey. What the Saudis lack is a large infantry. That's provided by Turkey, Pakistan, and Egypt. That means that could indeed prove to be a highly attractive alternative to what has been termed the previous American order that has predominantly dominated the Middle East.
Could it be that if this defense alliance is meant to be worth more than the paper it's printed on, but I certainly have my serious doubts about that. I mean, it was the case that immediately after this pact was announced, the Houthis in Iran tried to attack Saudi Arabia again with drones and missiles. And neither Turkey nor Pakistan really lifted a finger, despite it obviously being a classic case of an attack on one of the member countries of this pact. Conversely, it's just as unimaginable that Saudi Arabia would go to war against India if another conflict with Pakistan arises there. So, does anyone take these military announcements seriously?
First off, it's the Middle East. And secondly, as I just mentioned earlier right now, people are in a state of panic. Man, you can just feel an old, I don't really like using the term order here because it wasn't really an order, but rather an old system is now collapsing. And with nothing new appearing on the horizon, people are striving to reposition themselves. And this is one of those steps. That's why I said it's half and half. It's partly a threat scenario aimed at Washington. If you don't deliver now, we'll pursue a different path. And it's an endeavor to explore how we can truly accomplish anything in this Middle East without the US, especially if Iran. It's still the Islamic Republic remaining under the control of even more radical elements than 6 months ago, that this conflict will definitely survive, particularly with troublemakers and such. That's how I initially assessed the situation. And then, naturally, each individual actor anticipates gaining something from it. Erdogan and Turkey genuinely aim to massively assume a central hegemonic role in the Middle East. They are actively pursuing this objective on many different fronts at the present moment. Perhaps the sole positive recent development, if there is one, involves the ongoing and progressively advancing peace process with the PKK. This initiative has reached a point where the Turkish parliament has now formally enacted the necessary corresponding legislation to support it. It is in fact the integration of the Kurdish SDF units into the Syrian army itself. And all of this only works because Turkey is essentially operating in the background, exerting significant pressure and influence on the situation. This would effectively eliminate, or at least significantly weaken, one of Turkey's major ongoing conflicts, while simultaneously drawing Syria much more deeply into its sphere of influence, solidifying Turkey's regional power. That's exactly what we're currently witnessing, where the Israelis proactively carried out an airstrike on an airbase in northern Syria precisely because Turkish radar installations and fighter jets were scheduled to be stationed there. And yet, Turkey isn't directly involved in all these ongoing conflicts at the same time. This means it's also leveraging its exceptionally strong connections in Washington, operating with the idea that we are now poised to become a genuinely influential power. And Turkey has absolutely no territorial or other kind of conflicts with Pakistan. And ultimately, though it had past ideological clashes with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, there aren't any territorial disputes. And I would surmise that these are indeed the kinds of considerations and calculations that are playing a significant role in this situation. The reason it ultimately won't work is because the Middle East has perpetually suffered from various states, none possessing sufficient strength, constantly vying to establish themselves as the hegemonic power over one another. Sometimes it was Iran, sometimes Turkey, sometimes Egypt, sometimes the Saudis. This is a story that isn't new, and it has always led to new conflicts very quickly.
In recent weeks, at least two nations within this burgeoning alliance have noticeably escalated their vehemently anti-Israeli rhetoric. Specifically, Turkey has been a prime example of this trend. Then, reconquering Jerusalem and other fantasies are discussed. And on the other hand, in Pakistan, from where we've heard from high-ranking political circles that Israel is the greatest threat to Muslims across the globe, and all Islamic nations must ally themselves against Israel, and so forth. Are we witnessing a resurgence of the anti-Israeli rhetoric on the international stage in the Middle East, which we had finally believed to be gone for good?
Well, I mean, that's also part of the reason why the Abraham Accords model isn't particularly attractive at the moment, because we've observed that these countries, not necessarily Turkey, but the others, have somewhat reduced their rhetoric, haven't they? In the case of Pakistan, it's clearly, in large part, also about the conflict with India. India has excellent relations with Israel, and India has now reacted very strongly to this defense alliance, immediately stating, we won't allow this, and so on. So the Indians have. Very made it explicitly clear what their opinion is of this so-called defense alliance. On the other hand, of course, this global movement of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which is evident everywhere, is highly attractive for countries that have been involved in such activities for decades, as it allows them to strategically reposition themselves on the world stage, thereby furthering their agendas and influence in the international arena. In the case of Turkey, we're seeing this is also about, very specifically, for example, the question of who has what kind of influence in Syria. Right, that this was very clearly shown. Was made very clear by the bombing of that airport. And additionally, all these players recognize that Israel currently projects an image of weakness in a region where the dynamics of strength and weakness carry paramount significance. This means that just a year or a year and a half ago, the alliance between the United States and Israel appeared extremely robust, and regarding the Israelis' approach against Hezbollah, there was a noticeable degree of restraint observed. Israel's current policies towards Iran, Hezbollah, and Gaza, where not even one problem has been remotely solved, combined with the impending elections and the question of who might emerge victorious, now give the impression that Israel is considerably weaker than it once was. And that greatly facilitates for nations such as Pakistan or Turkey under Erdogan, who have consistently capitalized on this anti-Israel sentiment to significantly escalate their hostile rhetoric.
No, but let's just zoom out a little bit. One of the forecasts, or let's put it another way, When the Iran war broke out, there were the grimmest predictions about the devastating economic effects it could have, from skyrocketing oil prices to who knows where else. Now we're seeing that so far the economic consequences have remained somewhat within reasonable limits, at least at first glance. The oil price hasn't exploded nearly as much as was sometimes feared, and there have always been phases where it has dropped off again. And so overall, the economic impact of this war seems to have been less severe than one might have feared. Is this a premature assessment, or is the worst yet to come, or just a mild outcome?
Well, I think there are about three things that need to be said about this. Firstly, as a minor success for the US, there's that. One would. We have to realize that there are currently ways with transponders switched off and under the protection of the US Navy and US Air Force to pass by the Omani coast and allow more oil tankers to exit the Strait of Hormuz than was possible just 2 months prior. This means that Iran is no longer able to effectively maintain its blockade, at least not to the extent it would like. That's in the last. So that means more oil is coming out of the Strait of Hormuz than before. That, of course, also has an impact on the fact that the oil price isn't continuing to rise dramatically. When discussing the economic consequences, I believe we must sharply distinguish between the impacts on Europe and the US. In these areas, on one hand, they can still absorb certain economic shocks relatively well due to their greater purchasing power. So it's probable that the consequences might be, let's say, somewhat delayed, and as such. Like they could be slightly postponed, and in other countries, particularly those of the so-called Global South, where the repercussions of this war are already being tremendously felt. Thus, the poorer people are, the more severely they are impacted by elevated oil and food prices. Currently, even JP Morgan has issued a warning regarding 2027, indicating a potentially devastating convergence of various factors that could precipitate a global food crisis. On one hand, we have the climate, specifically the extremely hot and arid summer, along with the impending El Niño phenomenon, which is expected to severely impact the southern hemisphere once more. In addition to that, there are the export restrictions on wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and, of course, the soaring oil prices. And also the extremely high fertilizer prices, because much of it comes from Qatar and those other countries. This means that if nothing changes very quickly, we could see a situation unfold that's quite similar to 2011, where the prices for essential staple foods in populous, poorer nations might suddenly experience a very sharp and dramatic increase. And that is always, so to speak, a principal cause for uprisings, mass demonstrations, and civil unrest, So if we look at 2011, the Arab Spring had many causes, but one cause was simply the rising prices of staple foods and the rising price of bread. That means when we in still quite wealthy Europe say, okay, well, a liter of gasoline still only costs €2 or $2.20, that's one thing. What impact that has in sub-Saharan Africa or in India or in Bangladesh is a completely different matter.
I think with this less than optimistic outlook, we can also bring our conversation to a close for today. Thomas, thank you for taking the time once again. I'm sure we'll speak again in a few weeks, but for the time being, enjoy your stay in France.
Yeah, thank you. I will. You all have a nice afternoon in Vienna.
And to you, our dear viewers, as always at this point, the request. If you like this video or you like our videos, then give us a thumbs up or a like. Comment in the comment sections below. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And otherwise, yes, thank you for your attention and see you next time.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.